somewhere in the sprawling mess of bureaucracy that held together 300 sentient species, someone had decided that military exchange programs were the key to lasting peace, not trade. Agreements, not cultural. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel, that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Festivals, not even the universal translator that had finally cracked the Griffithian whistling language. No. What the galaxy truly needed was soldiers from different worlds bunking together, sharing ration packs and learning to shoot each other's weapons while pretending to enjoy it. The Interstellar Defense Coalition, in its infinite wisdom, had chosen the Meridian Collective as the first recipients of a human exchange officer. The Meridians were a practical choice, really. Bipedal oxygen breathers, similar gravitational preferences, and most importantly, they had not tried to conquer Earth during first contact. The bar for interstellar friendship sat remarkably low these days. The Meridians themselves were a fascinating evolutionary accident. Picture a species that looked like someone had taken the concept of a large cat, given it opposable thumbs, excellent posture, and an unsettling amount of intelligence. Their fur came in patterns that would make any Earth tiger jealous. Their eyes reflected light with an eerie golden glow, and they moved with the kind of grace that made human soldiers look like they were perpetually falling downstairs. They stood roughly 2 m tall, possessed retractable claws that could slice through standard-issue armor plating, and had built an empire spanning 47-star systems without ever inventing coffee. That last part alone should have disqualified them from the program. Their military structure was equally peculiar. The Meridians had something humans did not, something that made their armed forces uniquely challenging. For integration purposes, cubs, not metaphorical cubs, not cadets, affectionately nicknamed but actual juvenile Meridians who began military training at approximately 6 standard years of age. The Meridian philosophy held that warriors should be raised, not recruited. It was a cultural cornerstone that had served them well for millennia, producing soldiers with reflexes honed from childhood and an instinctive understanding of pack tactics that human military theorists studied with equal parts admiration and horror. Commander Thrace, the human selected for this historic undertaking, had approximately 48 hours of cultural sensitivity training before being loaded onto a transport and shot across half the galaxy. Those 48 hours had covered such essential topics as proper grooming, etiquette around feline species, the 17 different meanings of ear position in Meridian body language, and why you should never, under any circumstances, use a laser pointer during official meetings. What the training had somehow failed to mention was that Thrace would be sharing barracks with a mixed unit that included 8 juvenile Meridians, each between 7 and 12 standard years old. The transport touched down on Meridian Prime during what the locals called the cooling season, which translated to temperatures that would make a desert lizard sweat. The facility sprawled across a rust-cooled plateau, all angular architecture and training grounds that looked designed to break spirits and bones in equal measure. Thrace stepped off the transport in full dress uniform, carrying a regulation duffel bag and the weight of representing an entire species on broad, but very human shoulders. The welcoming committee consisted of high strategists, then a silver-furred meridian whose tail swished with the kind of controlled precision that suggested decades of military discipline, and 8 pairs of golden eyes attached to cubs who were supposed to be standing at attention, but were instead engaged in what appeared to be a silent competition to see who could stare at the human without blinking. The cubs wore miniature versions of the standard meridian combat harness, all straps and pouches designed for bodies that moved in ways human spines simply refused to accommodate. Ven's greeting was formal, practiced, and delivered in flawless standard galactic. The translation implant behind Thrace's ear rendered it with only minimal lag and a faint buzzing sensation that would take weeks to get used to. The speech covered honor, cooperation, the bonds forged through shared hardship, and several metaphors involving hunting that did not quite translate but sounded vaguely threatening. What the speech did not cover was living arrangements. That particular surprise waited until after the facility tour, the weapons demonstration, and a meal consisting of something that tasted like chicken, if chicken had been raised on a diet of pure anxiety. The barracks turned out to be a long rectangular structure with sleeping platforms arranged along both walls, a communal washing facility that required its own orientation, and absolutely zero privacy beyond a foot locker for personal belongings. Thrace stood in the doorway, duffel bag still in hand, watching as the 8 cubs who had been part of the welcoming committee filed past and began claiming their platforms with the kind of territorial certainty that suggested this had been their space long before any human arrived. The platforms were designed for meridian proportions, which meant they were simultaneously too narrow and too short for human comfort. Each came with a thin sleeping mat, a thermal regulator, and a shelf for personal effects that currently held an array of items ranging from carved wooden figures to what appeared to be someone's collection of interesting rocks. One of the older cubs, fur patterned in bold stripes of orange and black, paused at the platform directly across from where Thrace had been assigned. The cub's name was something with too many consonants and a trill that human vocal cords could not quite manage, so everyone just called them Stripes. Helpful. Stripes looked at Thrace with the kind of intense focus that cats gave to birds through windows, then spoke in halting standard galactic. The grammar was textbook perfect, but the accent made every word sound like a question. You are the human warrior we have heard. Story as a truer species requires 8 hours of unconsciousness. Every rotation, the other cubs stopped their platform preparations to listen. 7 pairs of golden eyes fixed on Thrace with unnerving attention. Sleep. Thrace corrected gently, dropping the duffel onto the assigned platform with a thud that echoed through the barracks. We call it sleep, and yeah, about 8 hours give or take. A smaller cub, barely tall enough to reach the upper shelf of their platform, chittered something in the meridian native tongue. The translation implant caught most of it, something about humans being fragile, something about prey species. The other cubs made sounds that the implant unhelpfully labeled as amusement vocalizations. Meridians require only 4 hours. Stripes informed Thrace with what might have been pride or might have been pity. Ear positions could mean either. We are Efficient, lucky you, Thrace muttered, beginning to unpack the duffel. Contained the essentials, spare uniforms, personal data pad, toiletries. A photograph that had been laminated too. Survive space travel in a small bottle. Of something that was definitely against regulations, but had survived 3 bag inspections through careful placement and creative packing. High strategist. Vin appeared in the doorway, tails swishing in what the cultural training had identified as satisfaction. I see you are settling in. The Cubs will assist with your orientation. They are among our finest trainees. You will learn much from each other. The way Ven said it suggested there was an entire layer of meaning that the translator was missing, possibly several layers, maybe an entire semantic cake of implications that would only become clear through painful experience. I'm sure we will, Thrace replied, because what else could one say? Complaining on the first day seemed like poor form, even if the sleeping platform looked about as comfortable as a wooden plank and smelled faintly of whoever had used it before. Vin departed with a swish of tail and the kind of graceful exit that made human walking look even more awkward by comparison. The barracks fell into what might have been silence if not for the ambient sounds of a military facility at evening hours. Somewhere distant, someone was running drills. Closer by, equipment hummed with a particular frequency that suggested alien engineering and power sources that did not quite play nice with human inner ears. Thrace finished unpacking and sat on the platform testing its support. It held barely. The thermal regulator attached to the wall offered settings ranging from Arctic to please stop, I'm already dead. There appeared to be no middle ground. The Meridians prefer cool, their home world having evolved them for temperature regulation that favored the lower end of the comfortable spectrum. Thrace made a mental note to requisition additional blankets and probably several layers of clothing. The Cubs resumed their evening routine, which apparently involved a complex series of grooming activities, equipment, maintenance, and social interactions that looked like play but probably had deeper cultural significance. Stripes kept glancing at Thrace, curiosity evident in the forward tilt of their ears and the occasional twitch of whiskers. Night cycle approached with the dimming of overhead lights to a soft amber glow that was probably perfect for Meridian night vision and absolutely terrible for human eyes trying to navigate an unfamiliar space. The Cubs settled onto their platforms with enviable ease, curling into positions that would put a yoga instructor to shame. Their breathing slowed, becoming almost imperceptible. Within 20 minutes, the barracks held 8 sleeping Meridians and 1 very awake human lying on a small platform, staring at an alien ceiling, wondering what exactly the next few months would bring. The answer, as it turned out, would involve significantly less sleep than regulation required and significantly more interdisciplinary chaos than any military exchange program had anticipated. But that revelation waited for tomorrow. Tonight, exhausted from travel and cultural shock, Thrace finally drifted off, unaware that human sleep came with features that would soon become legendary across the entire Meridian military complex. The trouble began at approximately 200 hours, though nobody would remember the exact timing because everyone was too busy experiencing auditory trauma to check their chronometers. Thrace had fallen asleep around midnight. After several hours of tossing on the inadequate platform and trying to find a position that did not result in immediate cramping, exhaustion, eventually won over comfort as it always does, and consciousness faded into something resembling rest. What happened next would be documented in 3 separate incident reports, 2 medical evaluations, and 1 unofficial video recording that circulated through the Meridian military network for weeks before command finally tracked it down and deleted it. The sound started low, a rumbling that might have been mistaken for distant machinery of machinery, regularly built to a crescendo that rattled the wall panels. Then came the main event, a noise that human medical personnel technically classified as severe nocturnal breathing obstruction, but which everyone else in the galaxy would simply call a territorial dispute between a chainsaw and a dying engine. Thrace snored, not the gentle wee of moderate sleep apnoea, not the soft whistle of someone with minor congestion. This was snoring as performance art, snoring that suggested evolutionary history had installed a malfunctioning turbine somewhere in the human respiratory system and forgot to include a mute button. The first cub to wake was Stripes, who shot upright on their platform with ears flat against their skull and pupils dilated to full moons. The Meridian instinct in such situations was clear: identify threat, assess danger, prepare for combat. Stripes did all 3 in under 2 seconds, claws extended, only to discover that the threat was the human exchange officer producing sounds that no living creature should naturally generate. The second cub woke moments later than the third. Then all 8 were awake and staring across the dimly lit barracks at the human who remained deeply, blissfully unconscious while creating enough noise pollution to violate several environmental regulations. What happened next defied all reasonable prediction. One of the younger cubs, a small thing with gray and white fur who went by Patches, tilted their head at the snoring human, ears swiveling forward with curiosity rather than alarm. Then Patches opened their mouth and produced a sound that was unmistakably an attempt to mimic the snore. It was terrible. It was adorable. It was the beginning of absolute chaos. Stripes stared at Patches. Patches stared back, then did it again, this time with more commitment and slightly better accuracy. The sound was higher pitched than Thrace's bass rumble, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Another cub giggled, which in Meridian translated to a chittering sound that the translation implant struggled to categorize. Then that cub tried their own imitation. Within 5 minutes, the barracks had transformed from a quiet military sleeping quarters into something that resembled a very confused orchestra tuning up before a concert. Nobody wanted to attend. 8 juvenile Meridians, each with slightly different vocal ranges and interpretations, were enthusiastically replicating human snoring, while the human in question remained entirely unaware of the situation. The oldest cub, a serious individual named something unpronounceable, who everyone called Boss, attempted to restore order by hissing for silence. This worked for approximately 6 seconds before Patches started up again, which set off 2 others, which caused Boss to give up on discipline and reluctantly admit that the sound was kind of funny if you thought about it from the right angle. The noise level increased. Cubs were now experimenting with variations, adding their own creative flourishes to the basic snore template. One managed to incorporate a whistle, another discovered that adding a growl on the exhale created an interesting harmonic effect. They were having entirely too much fun, and the fact that this was completely inappropriate for military trainees at 200 hours only made it funnier. Stripes displaying the leadership qualities that suggested future command potential made an executive decision. If they could not stop the noise, they could at least try to wake the human who started it. Stripes hopped down from their platform and approached Thrace's sleeping form with the caution of someone approaching unexploded ordnance. The first attempt involved gently shaking a shoulder. Nothing. Thrace continued snoring now, with a slight whistle on the inhale that three cubs immediately tried to replicate. The second attempt involved shaking harder. Still nothing. Humans, it seemed, slept with the determination of someone who had learned to ignore distractions through years of military service. Stripes looked back at the other cubs, all of whom had stopped their own noisemaking to watch this experiment with great interest. Boss suggested louder verbal attempts. Patches recommended cold water. The smallest cub, who barely spoke standard Galactic, offered something that the translator rendered as maybe poke it with a stick, which said concerning things about meridian problem solving strategies. Before they could implement any of these solutions, footsteps approached from outside. Heavy footsteps, authority footsteps, the kind that suggested someone with rank, insignia, and a deep investment in quiet night hours. Every cub froze. Stripes scrambled back to their platform with impressive speed. The barracks achieved instant silence except for Thrace, who continued snoring with the consistency of a natural phenomenon that cared nothing for military protocol or the panic of young trainees. High strategist Vin appeared in the doorway, first slightly ruffled from sleep, eyes reflecting the amber emergency lighting within glow that promised consequences. Ven surveyed the scene. 8 cubs attempting to look innocent despite clearly being wide awake, and one human sleeping through what had apparently been enough noise to disturb multiple. Barracks. Vin's tail swished once, a sharp movement that the cultural training would have identified as severe displeasure. Then Vin listened to the snoring, ears rotating forward with something that might have been disbelief. The high strategist stood there for a full 30 seconds, processing the situation before speaking in a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. Tomorrow we discuss appropriate sleeping arrangements. Tonight you will all return to sleep and ignore the human's breathing difficulties. Is this understood? 8 cubs nodded with synchronized enthusiasm, then departed, tails still swishing with barely contained something that might have been irritation or might have been the meridian equivalent of trying not to laugh. Hard to tell with the cultural differences. The barracks settled back into attempted silence. Cubs curled on their platforms, trying very hard to sleep, while the human continued producing sounds that evolution had apparently approved, despite all evidence suggesting it should not have. Patches, unable to resist, managed one more quiet imitation before Boss hissed a final warning. Dawn arrived to find 8 exhausted Merid cubs and one well-rested human who had absolutely no idea what had transpired during the night. By morning formation, word had spread through the entire facility. The human snored. This was not News. What constituted actual news was that the Cubs had apparently formed some kind of chorus about it, which meant that what should have been a minor cultural quirk had transformed into situation requiring official attention. High strategist then summoned Thrace to the command office immediately after breakfast, which consisted of something proton-based that fought back even after cooking. The walk there involved passing no fewer than 12 Meridian soldiers who suddenly found their equipment fascinating when the human approached, though several tails swished in patterns that suggested barely suppressed amusement. The office was sparse, decorated with battle honors and strategic maps that looked impressive, but meant absolutely nothing to someone who had been on world for less than 2 rotations. Ven sat behind a desk clearly designed for Meridian proportions, making the high strategist look even more imposing than usual. We have a problem, Vin began without preamble, tails swishing with controlled precision. Your nocturnal vocalizations have disrupted Barracks' harmony. Thrace blinked. My what now? You snore loudly. The Cubs have taken to imitating you, which has resulted in 0 hours of productive rest for anyone involved. Then pulled up a data pad and turned it around. This is a decel reading from last night. For comparison, this is the sound level of our standard transport engines during launch. The 2 readings were uncomfortably similar. I had no idea, Thrace said, which was true. Nobody had ever complained during training rotations back on Earth, possibly because human barracks were designed with the understanding that soldiers produced various unfortunate sounds during sleep and walls should be thick enough to contain them. Medical will examine you. We need to understand if this is typical for your species or if you require treatment. Ven's ears flattened slightly. Also, we need to understand why the Cubs find it necessary to replicate the sound. This is not standard behavior. The medical facility was staffed by a doctor whose fur had gone silver with age and whose patients had apparently done the same. Dr. Kess had been practicing military medicine for longer than Thrace had been alive and had the kind of professional demeanor that suggested very little could surprise them anymore. This situation, however, seemed to be testing that assumption. Lie down, breathe normally, try to simulate sleep conditions without actually sleeping. The doctor's tail swished with scientific curiosity rather than judgment, which was something Thrace complied, feeling ridiculous. The medical scanner hummed, projecting data that looked like abstract art to human eyes, but apparently made perfect sense to Meridian medical training. Dr. Kess made several interested noises, ears swiving as they processed information. Your airway constricts during relaxation, common in humans. According to the database, the vibration of soft tissue creates the sound. The doctor pulled up comparative anatomy charts. Meridians lack this particular design flaw. Our respiratory systems do not produce such vocalizations, so I'm stuck with it. There are devices, treatments, none available on this facility. The doctor's whiskers twitched. However, that does not explain. The Cubs bring them in. The 8 Cubs arrived looking like they expected punishment, ears back and tails still. Dr. Kess lined them up and began scanning, muttering in the Meridian native tongue. The translation implant caught fragments about pack bonding in mimicry, instinct, and unprecedented behavioral adaptation. After 20 minutes of examination, the doctor sat back with an expression that was difficult to read but might have been fascination. Cubs mimic authority figures. It is how they learn. Your snoring registers to them as a vocalization of dominance and security. They replicate it because their instincts identify you as part of the pack structure. They stared. They think snoring is a power move. They think it signals that the environment is safe enough for deep rest, which to Meridian cubs indicates a protected territory. The doctor pulled up more data. The mimicry should fade as they acclimate. However, attempting to suppress it may cause confusion and stress. So we just let them keep snoring. Dr. Kess's tail swished with what might have been amusement, unless you have a better solution. Human. Yes, we let them keep snoring. High strategist Vin received this report with the expression of someone who had joined the military for honor and glory and had somehow ended up managing an interesting snoring crisis. This is absurd. This is biology. The doctor corrected. The cubs are healthy. The human is healthy. They are simply incompatible with shared sleeping quarters unless we accept unusual noise levels. Ven's ears flattened completely. Fine, we adapt, but if this spreads beyond one barracks human, you will be sleeping in isolation. It was already too late. By evening formation, 3 other barracks had reported similar incidents. Apparently, cubs talked to cubs, and mimicry was contagious when it came to behavior that was both novel and vaguely rebellious. By week 3, the snoring had become institutional. What began as one barrack's worth of chaos had metastasized into a facility-wide phenomenon that command had simply stopped trying to fight. The cubs snored. The humans snore. Everyone was tired. This was military life now. Other species stationed at the facility had opinions. The Krello, who did not sleep so much as enter temporary standby mode, found the entire situation baffling. The Vorton delegation recorded samples for their xenobiology archives and left looking vaguely traumatized. A visiting admiral from the Centauri fleet listened to one night's worth of barracks activity and requested immediate transfer back to their ship, citing acoustic warfare concerns. High strategist Ven demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that had earned their rank simply reassigned anyone who complained and stopped pretending this was a problem that could be solved. The official report filed with the Interstellar Defense Coalition described it as cultural integration through adaptive behavioral modification, which was bureaucratic language for we gave up, and everyone is just dealing with it. Now, Thrace meanwhile had become something of a legend, the human who weaponized sleep, the exchange officer whose greatest contribution to Meridian military culture was teaching an entire generation of cubs that snoring was an acceptable expression of pack solidarity. It was not the legacy anyone had planned, but it was the legacy they got. The cubs thrived, somehow, despite the noise and the disrupted sleep schedules. Their training scores improved. Dr. Kess theorized it had something to do with stress reduction and feeling secure in their environment. Command theorized it was spite. Either way, the barracks that housed the snoring human and their mimicking cubs outperformed every other unit in the facility across 3 consecutive evaluation cycles. 6 months into the exchange program, Thrace received a commendation for outstanding contributions to interspecies, cooperation and unit cohesion. The ceremony was formal, the medal was real. High Strategist Vin presented it with a kind of expression that suggested internal screaming, "Your service here has been memorable," Vin said, which was diplomat speak for several other things that could not be said during an official ceremony. The Cubs have learned much from you, they really have, Thrace agreed, keeping a straight face through sheer force of will. That night the barracks fell into its familiar rhythm, one human snore, answered by 8 juvenile meridian approximations, creating a symphony that would have horrified acoustic engineers, but somehow worked for the beings producing it. Somewhere in the facility, an off-world observer was updating reports for the Interstellar Defense Coalition. The report would eventually recommend expanding the exchange program. It would cite improved morale, enhanced pack bonding, and measurable performance improvements. It would carefully avoid mentioning the snoring, because some things simply could not be explained to people who were not there to experience them. In the barracks, nobody was thinking about reports or legacy or the broader implications of interspecies military cooperation. They were just sleeping loudly together, which turned out to be